Wyoming Territory, December 1879, the wind howled like a beast through the mountain pines, and the snow came down hard, white and sharp in the moonlight. Odessa Rylan's boots crunched through the frozen crust as she stumbled forward, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She held her baby girl close to her chest. Wrapped in everything, Odessa owned 2 threadbare blankets and her last good dress. The child whimpered, a sound so faint it barely reached past her mother's collarbone. "Please, Olive," Odessa whispered, her breath fogging around her mouth. "Just a little longer, baby, just a little more." The girl didn't answer. She was too cold, skin pale and lips a worrying shade of blue. Odessa's heart twisted. She had been walking since dawn, heading west through the forest after the wagon gave out 2 days back and the trail went dead. Her husband had died in the spring from a fever, and there was no one left to help her. She had tried to make it to her cousin's homestead in Jackson, but snow came early, and now the world was nothing but white and wind. She tripped on a frozen root and nearly fell, catching herself just in time to keep Olive from tumbling. Her knees hit hard, but she did not cry out. She could not waste the breath. Then, through the trees, she saw a flicker of orange, firelight. Her legs moved before her thoughts caught up. She pushed forward, branches snagging her skirt. The light grew brighter until she broke through the tree line and found a small camp tucked beneath a rock bluff. One man, a fire, and a canvas tent. He turned at the noise of her stumbling in, standing fast with one hand near his belt. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, his long coat dusted with snow. His dark eyes locked on hers, then dipped to the bundle in her arms. "Help me," she choked out. He crossed the space between them in 3 quick strides. "Get over here," he said, voice low but steady. She dropped to her knees by the fire as he knelt beside her. He opened the blankets with careful hands, revealing the still, pale face of a baby girl barely breathing. "She's freezing," Odessa said, her voice cracking. I tried," the man did not answer with words at first. He shrugged off his heavy coat and then, to her surprise, pulled off his wide-brimmed hat and set it gently by her side. Snow clung to his black hair, half frozen, but he did not seem to notice the cold. "I'll be your shelter now," he said. Then he reached out and took the child from her arms. Odessa's heart lurched. "Wait," but he held Olive against his chest, wrapping her in his coat and pulling her close. The firelight flickered across his face, catching in his jawline and the tight set of his mouth. "She needs body heat," he said. "The fire's not enough." Odessa blinked, her hands shaking as they hovered near the edge of the coat. She's breathing." "Barely," he answered. "Come here, sit close." "She needs both of us." She inched closer, curling into his side, pressing her arm against his so that their warmth combined. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke. The wind howled outside the bluff and snow whispered against the canvas tent. Inside the circle of firelight, time slowed. "I'm Odessa," she said finally. "Odessa Rylan. My baby's name is Olive," the man nodded. "Quinn Rawley. I was riding back to my cabin when the storm hit." Odessa looked down at Olive, whose breaths were shallow but steadier now. "Thank you," she said, voice hoarse. "I didn't know where else to go." "Well," he said, eyes still focused on the baby girl in his arms, "you found me." They stayed close through the night, taking turns holding Olive, feeding her sips of warm broth from Quinn's tin cup once she stirred enough to drink. Odessa had not slept in 2 nights, but she forced herself to stay awake, watching her child's color return little by little. When morning came, the snow had stopped. The world outside was silent and white. Quinn stood and stretched out his back, then looked down at her. "My cabin's about an hour south from here. We can't stay out in the open. She needs warmth." "A roof." Odessa hesitated. "I do not want to trouble you more than I already have." "You're not," he said. "Trouble would have been finding you too late." She looked at Olive, now sleeping again with a faint flush in her cheeks. Quinn was already packing up the tent and securing his horse. He moved with quiet efficiency, not saying much, but offering Odessa a steady glance every so often. When he helped her into the saddle, she noticed how his hand lingered just long enough to keep her steady, but not so long it would make her feel weak. They rode through a narrow pass with the mountains rising high around them. Odessa held Olive tight in her arms, her cheek pressed to the baby's head. She felt Quinn's presence behind her, his larger frame shielding them from the wind. By the time they reached the cabin, the morning sun had turned the snow into glittering ice. The house was small but solid, tucked against a hillside with smoke already curling from the chimney. Inside, it was warm and clean. Quinn laid another log on the fire and lit 3 lamps while Odessa settled Olive into a cot by the hearth. "You live here alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Since spring. Bought the land from a trapper heading north." She looked around at the shelves, the tools, the neat stacks of firewood. Everything had its place. "You built all this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it." Odessa sat quietly, watching Olive sleep, her chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. Her daughter was alive, warm, safe. She felt tears sting her eyes but blinked them back quickly. Quinn crouched beside her. "She's strong," he said. "Gets that from her mother." Odessa looked at him then, really looked. His features were rough, sun-worn, but his eyes were kind, steady. "I do not know how to thank you," she said softly. "You do not have to," he replied. "You are here, she is breathing." "That's enough." A silence stretched between them, not awkward, just full. Then he stood. "You and that little girl need rest. I will cook us something hot." Odessa watched him move around the cabin, gathering a pot and some dried meat. She felt something stir in her chest, something unfamiliar in the wake of so much loss. Hope. She reached down and brushed Olive's hair back from her forehead. For the first time in months, the fear that had gripped her heart began to loosen. And she looked up at Quinn Rawley, the cowboy who had taken off his hat and said he would be her shelter. And she believed him. By the time the stew was ready, the light outside had thinned to that pale blue that came just before dusk. Quinn ladled it into 2 tin bowls and handed one to Odessa, who accepted it with both hands. The warmth seeped into her fingers. She hadn't realized how much she still ached from the cold until the heat made her aware of every joint. She tasted the broth in silence. Salt venison, the faint bite of wild onion. It was better than anything she'd managed since the wagon went lame. Across the hearth, Quinn ate with his head down, quiet but not withdrawn. He didn't fidget or fill the silence. He just sat steady, like the kind of man who'd never rush a thing that didn't need rushing. Odessa glanced over at Olive, now curled under a wool blanket on the cot, cheeks flushed from sleep. She didn't stir, not even when the wind knocked once against the cabin wall. "How far is town?" she asked after a while. "Evanston's a half-day south if the pass stays clear," he said, setting his bowl aside. "But they won't plow that road till spring." "I wasn't trying to reach town," she said. "I was hoping for Jackson. My cousin married a cattleman out there. Sent word when I was widowed, said they'd take us in." Quinn leaned back in his chair. "You were on the wrong trail for Jackson." "I see that now," she said, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You travel alone since summer," she nodded. "Left Nebraska in September. Took work in Cheyenne for a time, cleaning rooms. Saved what I could, bought an old wagon and a pair of mules. They didn't make it past the foothills." "You've done more than most would manage," he said. Odessa looked down at her hands. The knuckles were red and cracked. "Didn't feel like I was managing." He didn't offer comfort. Just got up, went to a small shelf near the stove, and returned with a crock of salve. He set it beside her bowl. It's lard and pine resin. "Warm your hands by the fire first." She did as he said, turning her palms toward the flames until the sting softened. Then she dipped her fingers into the jar and rubbed the balm across her joints. The scent was clean and sharp. "You make this yourself?" she asked. "Mother taught me," he said, eyes on the fire. "She was half Cherokee, grew up knowing what plants to use." Odessa blinked. That explained the neat bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the way he moved through the world like someone who listened more than he spoke. "Do you have family still living?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not close. My brother died last year in Colorado, mining accident. I'm sorry." Quinn nodded once but didn't elaborate. He took her empty bowl, washed both in a basin by the door, then hung the towel neatly on a peg. The rhythm of his movements calmed something in her, something that had been wound tight for months. "There's a second cot," he said. "Sheets are clean. You and the baby take it." "What about you? I'll take the floor." "The dog'll keep me warm." She hadn't noticed the hound until now, curled near the door, long-limbed and brindled. One eye opened when she looked over, then closed again. "I don't want to put you out," she said. "You're not." She studied him then, the slope of his shoulders, the way his hands rested on his knees. He was solid in a way no one had been since her husband passed, not just capable present. "You said the past might stay clear," she said. "If it doesn't, then you winter here." Odessa pressed her lips together. "I don't have much left, no coin, no food to trade." "I don't need either." Something in her chest tightened. "Then what do you need?" He looked up at her, meeting her gaze without flinching. "Nothing you haven't already given." Her breath caught. She couldn't answer that. Not yet. She rose and crossed the room to lift Olive into her arms, settling back onto the cot with the child against her shoulder. The baby gave a soft sigh, then went still again. Quinn banked the fire, doused the lamps, and returned with a spare quilt. He spread it over them gently, tucking it beneath Odessa's feet without a word. "I'll keep the stove going through the night," he said. She nodded, too full to speak. As he lay down with his dog by the hearth, Odessa stared at the rafters above her. The wind had slowed. The logs creaked softly as they settled into the cold. She didn't believe in miracles. Hadn't for a long time. But something in Quinn Rawley's quiet care, the way he offered help without asking for anything in return, made her think there might be a kind of grace in the world, even if it came in the shape of a stranger with a worn coat and steady hands. And though she didn't say it aloud, she knew it now, deep in her bones. They were no longer alone. The mornings came slow in the high country. Pale light crept through the frost-laced windows, and the world outside held its breath in stillness. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove lingered in the corners of the cabin, and Odessa stirred with Olive nestled in the crook of her arm. The child's skin was warm now. Sleep heavy. Odessa pressed her lips to Olive's temple and let the quiet sink into her chest. She hadn't known what peace would feel like, not after so many months of scraping forward, but here it was, holding still as if afraid to be noticed. Quinn was already at the table, sharpening a blade with long, deliberate strokes. He looked up when she sat up, but didn't speak right away. Just gave a short nod before returning to the whetstone. "I can help," Odessa said, swinging her legs over the cot. "I've mended, cooked, done laundry for a boarding house in Cheyenne. I don't like sitting idle." He set down the knife. "If you want to help, I've a stack of hides in the lean-to that needs scraping. Elk, I can show you how. I've never done that before. You'll learn." Outside, the snow was packed firm underfoot, the sky brittle blue overhead. Quinn pushed open the door to a small wooden lean-to built against the north wall of the cabin. Inside hung several hides stretched taut between poles, the air sharp with the scent of rawhide and lye. He handed her a blunt-edged scraper. "Keep the strokes even. You'll feel it catch if you press too hard." Odessa drew the blade over the hide tentatively at first. The work was slow, but her movements grew steadier, and the rhythm settled something restless in her hands. Quinn worked beside her, his silence companionable rather than distant. "You said your mother taught you about remedies," she said after a while. "Did she pass through Wyoming?" "No," he answered. "We lived near the Cherokee Strip. She stayed until I was grown, then she went back to her people." Odessa glanced over. "You weren't raised on the nation's land." "My father was white. We stayed near his kin. He died young." She nodded but didn't pry further. The air between them was quiet, filled only with the sound of the scrapers working over the stretched hides. It felt good to use her hands again, to do something that might be of value. By midday, her shoulders ached and the wind had picked up. Quinn stepped back and peeled off his gloves. "That's enough for today. You did well." She stretched her fingers, stiff from the cold. "It's honest work." He looked at her then, long enough that she felt the weight of it. "You've done more than your share of hard things." She turned her head, the praise sitting unexpectedly deep in her chest. "I would do it again if it kept Olive breathing." Quinn didn't reply, but his gaze lingered a moment longer before he turned and led the way back toward the cabin. Inside, Olive was awake and fussing, her voice thin and scratchy. Odessa scooped her up, whispering softly as she held her close. Quinn added wood to the stove, then busied himself with a small kettle and a pinch of dried chamomile. "She's likely thirsty," he said. "The snow air dries their throats." He poured the steeped water into a tin cup and let it cool slightly before handing it to Odessa. "She'll need to sip," he added. "Slow." Odessa cradled Olive in one arm and coaxed the cup to her lips. The child drank in small, greedy gulps, and when she coughed, Quinn handed over a bit of cloth already warm from his pocket. "You've done this before," Odessa said, glancing up. "A long time ago, a neighbor's baby took sick. My mother helped. I watched." "You remember that?" "I remember the mother's eyes. Same as yours now." She blinked, the words catching her off guard. He didn't mean it unkindly, just a simple truth. Later, as the sky grew heavy with dusk, Quinn went out to check the snares along the tree line. Odessa stayed near the hearth, rocking Olive gently, her thoughts turning over slow as river stones. When he returned, he brought a hare, already gutted and clean. He handed it over with a quiet offer. "You cook it how you like." She nodded, setting the meat on the board. "I'll need flour for dumplings." "Top shelf, left of the stove." She worked quietly, measuring by feel, her hands remembering the motions even if her body was tired. As the stew simmered, the air filled with the smell of broth and herbs, and Olive dozed again, this time with a soft sigh that made Odessa's throat tighten. She turned to find Quinn watching her, his eyes steady. "You could have turned us away," she said. "I didn't see the point. Most men would have." "I'm not most men," she held his gaze. "No, you're not." They ate by firelight, and he let her speak of small things, wildflowers she'd seen on the road, a lullaby her mother used to hum. He didn't interrupt, just listened, and she found herself saying more than she meant to. That night, after Olive was laid down and the fire banked, Odessa paused near the cot where Quinn had spread his blanket. "You sure you're warm enough?" He looked up from where he was laying his knife beside his boots. "I've weathered worse." She hesitated, then reached into her bundle and pulled free the last length of flannel she'd carried from Nebraska. "Here," she said, placing it near his pillow. "You shouldn't have to sleep without cover while we take your bed." He didn't argue, just nodded and drew it over his chest. As she turned back to the other cot, he spoke once more. "You don't owe me anything, Odessa." She looked back. "I know," she said. "But I want to offer what I can." And in the quiet that followed, something passed between them, not promise, not expectation, but a beginning. Not forged in fire or sudden passion, but in the slow, weighty pull of trust being built, piece by piece. Outside, the wind pressed soft against the walls, and inside, for the first time in many months, Odessa slept without fear. The snow held through January. Not heavy, but constant enough to keep the roads buried and the silence deep. Days passed in quiet rhythm, marked by the soft clatter of wood being split, the hum of cloth drawn through thread, the low murmur of a child's waking breath. The world outside the cabin narrowed to the steady beat of survival, and within that small circle, something else emerged unspoken but present as breath. One morning, Odessa stood near the window, pressing seeds into a strip of damp cloth she'd torn from an old shift. Her fingers worked carefully, folding each kernel with a precision born not of habit but of hope. Behind her, Quinn set down a pail of melted snow and leaned against the table, arms crossed. "You're planning ahead," he said. "I found them in the lining of my satchel. Didn't remember packing them." "Beans, maybe squash, spring's still far." "It'll come," she said, turning. "And when it does, I want something to put in the ground." Quinn didn't smile, but there was a shift in his gaze, like he was weighing her not for the first time but with new understanding. "You ever planted before?" he asked. "In Nebraska, yes. My husband and I had a patch behind the house. Nothing large, just enough." "You'll have more here," he said. Soil's decent on the south slope once the frost lifts. She paused, the cloth in her hands damp against her palms. Would that be all right if we stay past the thaw? His answer came without delay. I'd want that. She swallowed, then looked down at the seeds. Then I'll plant double. That afternoon, while Olive napped, Odessa followed Quinn to the shed behind the cabin. He'd begun repairs on a broken yoke, the wood split clean through. She knelt beside him, handed him wedges and nails as he asked, and watched his hands work with the same quiet intensity he gave to everything. Your brother, she said after a while. Did he live long out west? Quinn didn't glance up. 6 years. Worked a claim near Leadville, he wrote sometimes, said the mountains were cruel but honest. She ran her fingers over a strip of leather, listening. Did you see him before he passed? No, word came late. I buried him by the Snake River, had to mark the grave myself. Odessa didn't speak. She reached for a second wedge, placing it beside his hand. I never buried my husband, she said finally. He died in a tent, fevered and shivering. There wasn't time. Quinn reached for the wedge, his fingers brushing hers. You carry him still. I carry what I have left, what matters. The silence stretched, but this one wasn't empty. Later, as dusk crept in, she sat near the hearth, mending a tear in Olive's shawl. Quinn returned from the trap line with 2 grouse, their feathers still heavy with snow. He plucked them by the fire, careful to keep the mess contained, and when he finished, he handed the meat to her. I'll clean them, she said. You've been out since first light. I don't mind the cold. I know, she said, but I'd still rather you warm. He turned back to the fire then, and she saw his shoulders ease just a little. That night, after Olive had been fed and the kettle emptied, Odessa stood by the door, watching the moon rise over the ridge. The sky was clear, stars sharp as needles. Quinn joined her, arms folded, coat draped over one shoulder. You ever miss the quiet? She asked. He looked at her. It's never left. I mean the kind you had before someone else's footsteps shared your floor. He considered that. No, what I miss is the noise that means something. She turned to him, close enough now that she could smell the wood smoke in his collar. You think this means something? Yes, he said, voice low. I do. She didn't step back. Instead, she reached for his hand, not as question, but as answer. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. They stood like that until the cold crept through the floorboards and Olive stirred in her sleep. When Odessa turned to go back inside, Quinn followed, his hand still in hers. And though the night held its silence, something between them had shifted, no longer unspoken, no longer waiting. By late February, the ice along the riverbank had begun to crack in long, thin lines, and the sun stayed longer above the ridge. Odessa stood by the small shed where Quinn had laid out new boards for a chicken coop, sleeves rolled up to the elbow, hands raw from sanding. Her shoulders ached, but the ache was earned and she welcomed it. Quinn came up from the slope with a bundle of cedar slats under one arm. His shirt was damp along the collar, sleeves rolled just like hers, and the way he moved, quiet, focused, had long since become familiar. You've a good eye for square corners, he said, setting the boards down. I grew up with 5 brothers, Odessa replied, brushing sawdust from her skirt. If something needed fixing and no one else was sober enough to do it, I figured it out. That's how I learned. You ever want to leave where you were born? For as long as I can remember, she said. But I didn't know where to go until I had to. He nodded, crouching to measure out a notch in the beam with a pencil stub. You have a way of making things better by being near them. She looked down at her rough hands. I don't know if that's true. I wouldn't say it if it weren't. The quiet between them wasn't new, but it held more now. Not just patience or habit, but something that hummed just beneath the surface, steady and certain. Odessa picked up the hammer and drove in the next nail without needing to ask what came next. Inside, Olive let out a soft cry, sharp and quick. Odessa moved at once, but Quinn caught her wrist gently. I'll go, he said. You've earned a minute. She watched as he disappeared into the cabin, the door closing soft behind him. The sound of his voice, low and even, drifted out with the warmth. Olive quieted almost instantly. Odessa waited on the porch, arms crossed over her chest to keep the wind from her ribs. She watched the clouds pull long across the sky and felt, for the first time in years, the shape of a future forming not in dreams, but in the calluses of her palms and the steady way Quinn kept showing up beside her. When he returned, Olive bundled in one arm, he handed the child over with no pomp, just the kind of ease that came from repetition and choice. Odessa kissed her daughter's head, then looked up at him. "You're not just helping," she said. "You've become something more." Quinn gave a small nod. "I know. I've been trying to name it," she continued, "but maybe it doesn't need naming. Not if we both understand it." She held his gaze. "Do we?" "I think we do." The next few weeks passed in longer days and softer evenings. Snow gave way to patches of thawed soil, and Quinn showed her how to test for frost depth using a hickory rod. They laid out a garden plot together, measuring rows by hand and marking borders with flat stones. Olive sat in a basket nearby, content in the sun, her cheeks pink and healthy. One afternoon, Odessa stood at the edge of the slope, holding a seed packet between her fingers. She looked out across the trees, where smoke from the chimney rose in a lazy curl. Quinn stepped beside her, brushing his hand against hers. "I want to stay," she said, voice low. "Not just until the thaw, longer, as long as you'll have us." "I was hoping you'd say that." She turned to face him fully. "I still carry what I lost, I always will, but I don't feel broken here, you're not. And I don't feel alone." "You never were," he said, taking her hand. "Not since the night you found the fire." She leaned into him, forehead resting against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her without hesitation. The wind moved through the grass below, and a hawk circled high overhead. That evening, Quinn brought a small box from the shelf above the stove. He set it on the table and opened it to reveal a silver ring, simple, unadorned, the metal worn smooth by time. "It was my mother's," he said. "I've kept it since she passed." Odessa touched it with one finger. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." She slid it onto her finger where it fit without fuss. "Then I'll wear it every day of my life." They married beneath the budding aspens at the edge of the ridge, with Olive in Odessa's arms and the wind carrying the scent of thawed earth. No preacher found them, but vows didn't need paper to mean something. They were spoken with hands clasped and eyes steady, and that was more than enough. By spring, the garden sprouted in long, eager rows. Chickens clucked in the coop they'd built with their own hands, and Olive took her first steps in the grass behind the cabin, laughing as she tumbled into Quinn's arms. Odessa hung linens in the sun, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, and when she looked toward the cabin, she could see Quinn carving a new cradle from pine, whittling each curve with care. She walked to him slowly, the hem of her dress brushing new shoots of clover. He looked up when she reached him. "You think she'll like it?" "She'll love it," Odessa said. "Made by the hands that hold her safe." He brushed a thumb over her cheek. "Same hands that hold you." She leaned into him, lips finding his, slow and sure. When they parted, she rested her palm over his heart. "We found home," she said. "We built it." And in that quiet clearing beneath the wide Wyoming sky, with the garden blooming and their daughter's laughter echoing, they stood together whole, steady, and deeply, fiercely loved, forever and without doubt.